There's a banknote with 100 trillion written on its face. Not a typo, not a meme, an actual currency printed by an actual government, spendable, technically, in an actual store. At the exact moment it entered circulation, it couldn't reliably buy a loaf of bread. You've probably seen a photo of it online, passed around as a punchline about money printing gone catastrophically wrong. Here's what almost nobody knows. The country that printed that bill just posted its lowest inflation rate in almost 30 years. Not despite the collapse, because of it. This is how a currency had to die 5 times before it finally learned to live.
Rewind to the early 2000s. Zimbabwe's economy leaned hard on agricultural exports, tobacco especially, grown on large commercial farms. Starting in 2000, the government seized most of those farms in a fast-tracked land redistribution program. Whatever you think of the politics, the economics were brutal and immediate. Agricultural output cratered, export earnings went with it, and government revenue, the money the state actually had to spend, cratered right alongside both. A bad decision turns catastrophic the moment nobody's willing to absorb the loss. The government didn't cut spending to match its shrinking income. It kept spending on soldiers, on subsidies, on a war it was fighting in the neighboring Congo. Gideon Gono, running the central bank through most of this decade, covered the gap the only way left available to him. He printed money. More spending than revenue should mean debt. Debt should mean borrowing from somebody. But nobody would lend Zimbabwe money by that point, so Gono skipped borrowing and went straight to printing cash instead. Once a central bank discovers that printing money quietly covers today's bills, nothing inside the system forces it to stop. It works. Until it very suddenly doesn't. By November 2008, independent economists estimate month-over-month inflation peaked somewhere above 79 billion%. People were paid twice a day because their morning wage would lose real value by lunch. Some workers were reportedly paid in cash that needed a wheelbarrow to carry home. Eventually, Gono's bank printed a $100 trillion note just to keep pace with prices doubling roughly every day and a half. That wasn't a currency crisis anymore. That was a currency dying, the first of 5 deaths this story has to get through. A government that's just watched its own money turn into wallpaper doesn't easily learn to let go of controlling it. It takes 5 separate deaths before the lesson actually sticks, and Gono's hyperinflated dollar was only the first. In 2009, with that first currency dead, Zimbabwe gave up on having its own money at all and adopted the US dollar, alongside a handful of other foreign currencies. It worked, in the narrow sense that hyperinflation stopped overnight, like flipping a switch. But look at what got traded away to get there. No more setting interest rates, no more printing money to respond to a downturn the way most countries can. Zimbabwe swapped hyperinflation for a quieter, more permanent kind of powerlessness. By 2016, physical dollars had simply run out. Death number 2. Here's the thought-provoking part, though. That scarcity is exactly what John Mangudia, running the central bank since 2014, had to solve. His answer was bond notes, a domestic paper currency officially pegged 1-to-1 with the US dollar. Except the government never held enough real dollars to back that promise, and everyone eventually figured that out. The gap between the official rate and what people would actually trade a bond note for kept widening until the pretense collapsed. Death number 3. Mangudia tried again in 2019, reintroducing a fully domestic Zimbabwe dollar, banning foreign currency for local transactions by law this time, betting that declaring control over the exchange rate would make it real. It didn't. The new Zimbabwe dollar spiraled into its own inflationary freefall within 2 years. And by 2023, the population was right back to trusting anything except their own government's money. Death number 4. All 4 die of the exact same disease.
Each one tries to solve a trust problem with an announcement instead of a mechanism. You cannot declare your way into credibility. You have to build it. Something has to make printing money physically harder than typing a new number into a ledger. Otherwise, you're just handing a struggling gambler a fresh line of credit and calling it recovery. April 2024 nearly became the death that ended this story before it could be told. John Mushayavanhu had been running the central bank for exactly 5 weeks when he launched a fourth domestic currency, the ZIG, short for Zimbabwe gold, this time actually backed by a reserve of gold and foreign currency, not just a promise typed onto a banknote. For a few months, cautious optimism. Then, by September, 5 months after launch, and Mushayavanhu barely 6 months into the job, the central bank was forced to devalue the ZIG by more than 40%. Overnight. The banknotes got mocked so widely online that the bank quietly redesigned them the following year. Death number 5. The currency built to be different wobbled exactly like the 4 before it. The difference was what happened next. Underneath the wobble, the backing was still real, and Mushayavanhu chose to fix it instead of walking away. So what actually changed after the 5th death? Not the announcement. Zimbabwe had made 4 of those already, and every one collapsed. What changed was the mechanism underneath it, and the man willing to stand behind it in public. Every earlier attempt asked the population to trust the government's word. The ZIG is backed by something a government can't simply print more of on a bad afternoon. Gold sitting in a vault and foreign currency reserves that grew from roughly $285 million at launch to more than $730 million within about 14 months, according to the central bank's own reporting. It's not just a reserve story either. Gold now accounts for close to a quarter of everything Zimbabwe exports, meaning the metal backing the currency is also the thing earning the foreign income that keeps backing it, a loop that reinforces itself instead of eating itself alive. And this wasn't improvised. The central bank had been quietly rehearsing the idea for 2 years before ZIG existed, selling gold-backed coins to the public as a store of value starting in 2022, letting people get comfortable holding something tied to gold before betting an entire currency on it. Mushayavanhu didn't invent this move. He inherited the groundwork and finally had the leverage to use it. Run the inflation numbers forward, and the shape of the recovery is almost hard to believe. Annual inflation was still grinding above 80% as recently as September 2025. By January 2026, it had fallen to just above 4%, the first single-digit inflation reading Zimbabwe had posted since 1997. An entire generation of Zimbabweans has grown up, gone to school, and started careers without once living through a year where prices behaved the way prices are supposed to. Growth followed the same curve. The economy expanded around 6% in 2025, up from under 2% the year before, across agriculture, mining, manufacturing, and tourism at once, not just one sector propping up the rest. Walk into a shop in Harare today, and the difference isn't abstract. Price tags that used to get rewritten by hand, sometimes twice in a single day, now sit unchanged for weeks. Shelves that used to empty out ahead of a currency panic stay stocked. None of that makes headlines the way a $100 trillion banknote does, but it's the actual texture of healing at ground level. Boring, unremarkable stability, which is precisely what a country that survived 5 monetary deaths has been starving for. Trust, though, doesn't move on the same timeline as a chart. When the ZIG launched, an estimated 85% of everyday transactions were still happening in US dollars, not the currency Mushayavanhu was asking people to believe in. That number has come down since, but slowly and unevenly. Rural communities with limited access to ZIG notes have in some cases turned to the South African rand instead. People who watched 4 currencies die don't hand over their trust because a chart looks better this quarter. They wait. They watch. They keep a few dollars tucked away just in case, because just in case, used to be the only strategy that ever worked. Mushayavanhu knows this better than anyone. He's the one standing in front of them, currency in hand, asking them to believe a fifth time. The government has now set a public target of making the ZIG the sole legal currency by 2030, which is really an admission of where things stand today. Zimbabwe hasn't escaped dependence on outside money. It has built something solid enough, for the first time in a generation, that dependence finally looks like a choice instead of a life raft. Think of it like a borrower who spent 15 years defaulting on every loan anyone was foolish enough to hand him, until the day he finally showed up with real collateral instead of another promise. The gold in that vault isn't a clever policy invention. It's what happens when nobody will accept your word anymore, and you're finally forced to put something on the table people can actually hold in their hands.